Free Coffee Fridays are returning to the podcast all month long. I've partnered with my friends at JavaSock to give a handful of lucky listeners the new Self-Love JavaSock sleeve and a free coffee on me. Weekly winners will be announced on Instagram each Friday in the month of May, and all you need to do is email or DM me the code word coffee for your chance to win. It's that easy. Send the word coffee, nothing more, nothing less, just the word coffee by email or direct message, and you're automatically entered for that week. The code word coffee will be the same each week, so if you didn't win this week, you can still win next week if you send in another message for that week. You do have to be a United States resident, at least 18, and be a first-time winner. 2 ways to play, 1 weekly prize pack, and your next iced coffee, matcha latte, hot tea, or whatever you enjoy drinking is on me. To email the code word coffee, visit peaceofmepodcast.com or DM the word coffee at Piece of Me Podcast on Instagram. Thanks for listening and for being part of the Piece of Me community. Let's shift the paradigm to prioritize our peace and focus on the positive while creating balance to make living our best life the ultimate goal. We'll talk boundaries, self-care, mental health, and overcoming obstacles. You'll hear interviews and fresh perspectives to support you along the way. Let's elevate the conversation and level up our self-growth game. This is the Piece of Me podcast. One of the priorities of this podcast is to help you, my listener, live your best life through content that supports you wherever you are in your journey. My guest today is working to do the same by supporting those with mental illness. Her name is Paris Scobie, and she's the host of the Live Well Bipolar podcast. She too is helping people live their best life through resources to help others embrace their mental illness. With May being Mental Health Awareness Month, I really wanted Paris to be on my show to talk about her experience with depression, bipolar, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, sexual assault, and more. Now, if any of those topics are triggering to you, please be aware that you will hear them in this episode, so listener discretion is advised. Hi, friends, I'm Lexy Lee. If you're new here, welcome, and if not, then welcome back. The National Institute of Health reported in this year alone, 2024, 57.8 million people live with some type of mental illness, and the severity can vary from person to person. The National Alliance of Mental Illness states that 1 in 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness, and the average delay between symptoms and diagnosis is 11 years. 11 years of living with mental illness symptoms before receiving a diagnosis. 11 years of just wondering what's wrong and is all this normal. In this episode, Paris shares her personal experience since her own diagnosis nearly 10 years ago, her involuntary hospitalization, how she felt receiving her diagnosis, navigating this new life, her book, Crooked Illness, and much more. I'll link her information in the show notes below so you can grab her book or get further support. So let's dive in. Hi, Paris. Welcome to the Piece of Me podcast.
Hey, Lexy. Thanks for having me. It's been a minute. I know we were talking back and forth across Instagram. It's nice to see you virtually. I can give you a little hug through the screen, but thank you for having me. I'm excited to get into this conversation with you today.
I'm excited too, especially because I think your story is really going to resonate with the fact that it's Mental Health Awareness Month. And so many people, I think they need more education, they need more information. And I love that these conversations are becoming, I don't know, like more open on a platform. We're not hiding behind these things as much anymore. So, and especially you're so brave to share this. So I'm not going to give away your story. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into all the questions?
Yes. So a little bit about me. So my name is Paris Scobie. I am the host of Live Well Bipolar. I'm also the author of Crooked Illness, Lessons from Inside and Outside Hospital Walls. And I am a speaker for different nonprofits, mental health organizations, galas, fundraisers, and really me in a nutshell. I am someone who went from being a patient diagnosed. It'll be 10 years this December is when I received my diagnosis of bipolar 1 disorder. And then I, of all places, I did not expect to find myself returning to work at that same hospital a few years later, but I did. And something I can tell you guys is I held on to a lot of shame, a lot of fear. I felt very isolated until I began doing this, what I'm doing with you, Lexy, right now, telling my story, being publicly open about it. I did it very slowly over the years, but really my messaging is just reminding people the value that their lives hold because of their lived experience, and not thinking that my life has no value because of my lived experience. We can often go through different things that are difficult and traumatic, and we think because of these things have occurred, I don't have value. There's something inherently wrong with me. And that's how I felt in my experience. But just reminding people that, in the instances that we're able to seek help and get support and share when we're comfortable with, have that support network, find those people, they are out there. And that's all I'm about, whether I'm bringing those resources to you through my podcast, through my book, through speaking, whatever the medium is, that's really what I work to do, is to communicate how we can work to prioritize this and really keep this at the forefront, because we are the foundation for everything else. And I know you know that so well. So I'm excited to dive into these different parts of my journey with you today.
Yeah. And I think it's, it has to be so hard to share something that's very personal, that people can judge you for when they don't understand. And it's a very vulnerable thing to, especially on a public platform like the internet world, where we live in podcast world, where, these, our episodes are being streamed around the world. So to put yourself out there and share your journey and share, this diagnosis, like that's and it's so brave, like it's incredibly brave. And I think so many people are like, thank you so much for saying this, because they're going to be seen, they're going to feel validated. And which is also one of the reasons I love your book, because I think that it's like, I feel like we're going to get into that later. I'm jumping ahead because I'm excited, but Paris's book it's like talking to a girlfriend. Like, I feel like you're like talking to a really great girlfriend. You know what I mean? Yes. So anyway, okay. So let's talk about you. Let's talk about this diagnosis and what happened to you 10 years ago.
Yeah. So first of all, to give some more context, I was actually first diagnosed with depression when I was 16. So 16 years old. And then it wasn't until I was 19 that I received my bipolar 1 diagnosis and was hospitalized. But really what happened to me, so going all the way back, I can start as early as really when these thoughts started to surface, right? Of first just kind of negative self-thinking, and kind of how that started to spiral into what it did ultimately become for me, which, was a suicide attempt. And something that I went through from a very young age was sexual assault. So being 15 years old and going through something like that, and just not know that it's wrong, and knowing that this isn't something that I wanted to happen, this isn't my intention, but then expressing that and getting the help, getting the resources. I remember just feeling very alone, feeling like I just really started to internalize the shame and felt responsible, and really felt like that was on me. Like I was, somehow in some world, held accountable. And I think because of that, I had opened up to a few close people, right? When I was younger and in high school, I had some people that, I thought were, friends that I could talk about. And I remember it ended up getting around the school. And I remember walking through the halls one day and just hearing whispers, and like all of a sudden it would get, how it is, like your stomach drops and it's just quiet, and the laughs, and it's like eyes are on you, and just the words that we hear, being called in the halls, right? Okay, slut, or you chose to do this, or she's sleeping around, or all these different things. And I remember just feeling like I just started to really, in the beginning of it, I was like, this happened to me. And now I was like, you know what? Maybe I did deserve this, maybe something. And it was really, really bad. And I remember for a very long period of time, my way of dealing with that and coping with that was, in my mind, I thought it was pushing forward, just move past it. And really what I did is I dug that stuff deep inside of me, and I held on to, as an individual, like something is wrong with me because this happened to me. And I remember just, it started out with thoughts of, and even before that, prior like struggles with body image, right? And I never actually got a diagnosis with an eating disorder or anything, but I did struggle with that in my younger years for sure. I definitely had, issues with, the way that I looked and kind of presented and different things like that from a very early age, but it just got worse, after that kind of took place. And I remember my mind, I was like, you know what, maybe I can try to take back control I'll go out and I'll forget about it. I'll party and I'll drink. And, and for me, I was like, I'm going to go and sleep with different people because maybe that'll help me forget what happened. And it'll kind of like in my mind, I'm like layer on something to where that really wasn't that real, or it wasn't really as bad, and I would really invalidate my own trauma because I remember, and it was a lot. And especially going through that from a young age and just really not knowing, in my mind, I'm like, well, I am coping. I am dealing with it. And I remember my parents, like they also, I talked with them actually, I talk with them all the time, but I remember telling them like, hey, how did you guys feel back then? Cause I know how I felt. And I remember having a conversation with my mom and she's like, I just didn't know what to do. I really didn't know how to respond or react. I didn't know how to do anything. And as a parent, right, if you notice this in your child and you start to see them, pulling away, isolating, crying a lot, not eating as much. And really for me, it wasn't so much so like I'm not eating because of so much in the younger years of when I was like struggling with trying to control food for that way. It was just, I completely lost my appetite. I lost interest. I lost motivation. I lost drive. I used to run track and cross country and like really involved in like different clubs. It's such a hard thing to put into words, but it's almost like when your whole world just like the color just drains like slowly and slowly and slowly. And you're just starting to get hit with, the world would be better if you weren't here, or people don't like you. And it's just constantly like unwavering. And I know what that's like. And that's why I'm so today, like why I am so open. It did take me a while to become this way though, because that was back when 16 was the diagnosis of depression. 19 was the hospitalization, bipolar diagnosis. I was placed on court-ordered treatment. That was like the episode I remember fully in psychosis. And really that period of time, I really didn't start to make the changes to my lifestyle to really get on this path of what does it mean to live well bipolar, right? Until I was right before I turned 23, right? So I'm 29 now. So, all those years and it's taken me, being open, but yeah, that was kind of the start of when it was really bad back then in those days. And, this December will be 10 years since my hospitalization, which I used to look back on it and think that time was moving so slow because I was so far behind and I felt so stuck and so isolated. Now I look at it as like, I feel like I've learned so much and I have so many resources now and I have so much hope because I really looked at what can I control versus what I cannot control and where can I put myself? What environments am I in that are causing this? And I couldn't do this if I didn't give myself the ability to gain awareness into it, which I didn't do for a number of years. I just was on go mode. I was on survival mode. That's what I lived and operated in for a while.
Thank you, first and foremost. And I'm so sorry for what you went through and what you've had to heal from and overcome and find strength from. Like, my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking you went through this traumatic experience at the age of 15, which is just so young. And then you're diagnosed with depression at 16. Like, well, right? Like, I feel like, well, who wouldn't be after something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Like I almost feel like those things almost go hand in hand when you go through something so awful, when something like that happens to you.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I almost feel like it's...
Yeah. And I think looking back on it too, because I remember, and even when I got that diagnosis, I have bipolar in my family, right? There's other people that, live with the diagnosis. And I remember bringing this up in sessions later on. And I was like, I don't think this is, because I was taking the medication, I was doing what I was supposed to, but I'm like, I feel like there's something more going on. Like I'm trying, but it's and then but also I didn't have my very first experience with a manic episode until I was 19. So to give the listener some context, if they don't know what bipolar is, right? Maybe they're like, what is manic? What does that mean? So depression, bipolar depression, manic depression, bipolar used to be called manic depressive disorder. And it's the two sides, right? So there's different types of bipolar. So bipolar 1, bipolar 2, cyclothymia, bipolar unspecified. So I was diagnosed with bipolar 1. So that means present of episodes of depression and then mania. So mania, and then there's also hypomania as well, which you can experience. But going into things like, that's what I experienced, right? I was working 2 jobs at the time. I was in school. I was getting straight A's. I had a relationship. I was constantly fighting and arguing, but I had racing thoughts. I couldn't slow down. I wasn't tired. I just rapid speech, like these things that you Google, what is manic symptoms, right? I started having that at 19, but when I was diagnosed with depression at 16, I didn't have any of that. It was just that deep, dark for like 16, 17, 18, and then at 19. And often you'll see this because the age of onset or diagnosis for bipolar can be around, 22 to 25, but it's a little bit different for certain people. But I remember always thinking I was misdiagnosed, right? And I was, but at the same time, that wasn't ever present yet. So how could you get an accurate diagnosis, right? So that was really I just remember that for the longest time it was so hard to find the motivation to come out of it. And it was hard to even express it because I'm like, where did this come from? And I knew a lot of it was rooted in what had happened with the sexual assault. And then after there was a lot of abusive relationships that I ended up. And I think part of it was because I was in such a vulnerable state that I didn't think I had value. I didn't believe in my worth. So I really do believe that, for me at least, and I can only speak for myself, I do think that I did put myself in very unsafe situations, and I allowed those kind of people to crowd towards me because I was trying to escape. And if it meant more abuse, it meant more abuse. And I didn't think I was deserving of love until later. But yeah, so it was that depression for that time.
Mm. Now, when did your parents find out about the sexual assault?
Yeah. So I ended up telling them, so once that actually happened, when it did happen at 15, I remember talking to both of them. And yeah, I remember I talk about it in the book. There's a scene that I depict in there of when I went into my gynecologist's office. And I remember just being in tears and feeling like something I did was wrong, or I was somehow, and I remember she looked at me and she's like, it made no sense at the time, but she was the one who was like, you should write a book about this one day or 10. I'm like, what? I was like, that makes no sense. I don't know why you would say that. I'm like, it didn't make any sense, but I just remember that so clearly. And I have it in the story because I remember opening up about this and I just didn't feel supported. And I talk about it in the book. I don't want to give too much away, but just the relationship there. And I've been able to repair it, obviously, but the relationship with my mom was a big one that I just felt, no support, really dismissed in what I was trying to share. And, later on in life, was obviously able to have those difficult conversations that I didn't feel I could. And, now really be in such a great place with her where we talk every single day and, we have these check-ins and it's a lot different, but for a very long time, we just didn't have that relationship. And it was very hard for me to, especially very young, to feel like I don't have this with this person that I thought would be able to be there more than she was and wasn't. Right. So yeah, so I did open up right then, but I remember just that, like, also hearing back later of, being in denial about it, right? Of this didn't even happen. It wasn't even real. And then what do we, the things that parents can worry about of, if you're going to be pregnant, you're not having a kid, we're not dealing with this. And I remember being like told, you're going over here and you're getting an IUD, you're getting this, birth control. We're not going to be dealing with this. And I remember like, again, it kind of like layered on for me of like, okay, again, something is wrong. Like I played a part and I could have, and I would really do that. I would really like downplay my experience and be like, well, I could have been killed or I could have been, abducted or something. And I would always do that. I would always like these what if scenarios. And I feel like I did it to protect myself in a way of being like, it could have been like this, or this. But again, it didn't really allow myself the opportunity to grieve what had happened and to heal because I kept dismissing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, because it's like, and then that's, I think, there's so many things you said that I'm taking notes as Paris is talking, because there's so many things I want to touch on. One of the things you said a moment ago was that your family has bipolar. Like there's people in your family that have bipolar. Is it normally, like, just to kind of educate the audience, and I'm still learning about this too. So is it normally something that happens in the family? Does it like skip generations? Like how does that work? Do you know?
Yeah. So my understanding is there is a genetic component, right? So it could run in. So maybe like, either your parents, grandparents, like whoever, right, in the family is, has had a diagnosis. But then there's also people who, don't go to psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and they might be living with bipolar disorder potentially, but they've never received a diagnosis. So there is a genetic component to it as well. But I have also met people I've talked to over the years who have a diagnosis of bipolar, and they have shared, not to my knowledge, no one in my family lives with this, or at least I haven't been told this. And again, I think part of that goes back to people, again, the shame, right? If you might have someone in your family, but they would never openly admit to, I've struggled with this, or I have this diagnosis. So I definitely see all sides of it, but there is a genetic component that can play a part in that, as well as like environmental factors. And yeah, I've learned this over the years too, from the psychiatrists I've seen, therapists, and different things like that. So yeah.
So take us back to the day of hospitalization and what was going through your head. What was that day like? I mean, I'm sure it's probably made an impression in your brain forever, but if you could take us through that.
Yeah. So I remember I have it in my phone. So I was looking through the memories, right? And I was going back and I was sitting here because I realized, I said, wow, this year is going to be 10 years since the hospitalization. So I was hospitalized. It was December 19th of 2014. That was the day that I was hospitalized, and I was there for 2 weeks. So I remember coming out, it was the Monday of the 5th of January of 2015. And to walk you through what happened that day, I remember earlier in the day, and I do a lot better of this in my book by the way I kind of like lay out the whole framework and have it like depicted and like the imagery, and you actually feel like you're kind of with me there. But I had an appointment earlier that morning with a psychiatrist, and I remember I just felt so frustrated because I kept feeling like, I wasn't being heard. And I was like, hey, like I think that I'm living with bipolar disorder. And I remember at the time the psychiatrist I saw was like, no, like you're working 2 jobs, you're getting straight A's, like basically on paper, you're presenting well, right? So what you're telling me doesn't match up. And I was like, I get that, but I was like, I'm also like, is this normal? Like, I'm not tired. I was a cashier during the day and different hours. And then I also was a room service operator at a resort like near me. So I would work sometimes in the morning, like 5:30 in the morning till like 2. And then I go right from like 2 to like 3 to like 10 p.m. and be a cashier. And then I go out and party all night. So I'm like, it just doesn't seem normal. And I was trying to share what's going on. And I just kept feeling like it was constantly like dismissed and like, I don't even think you really need to be here. And I was like, what do I need to do? Like what, it just doesn't, I don't know. And it's sad because it makes me think of how many other people are in my position right now who are trying to say, here's what's going on, and they're being dismissed, right? Whether it's by a doctor or someone they feel comfortable opening up to. And also, again, it's not, not to place fault on, oh, this person, you're not putting it on one person. They're responsible for your life and all this stuff. But I think people just don't know. Some people just don't know what to do with that information. When you're saying, I'm going through this, like, they're like, okay, like, I don't know where to direct you. I don't know how to handle this. And I feel overwhelmed, right? But I know that was my experience. So I remember having that appointment and leaving. And I remember just like storming out, like even before the appointment was over. And I remember the psychiatrist called the police, and they actually escorted me back up to the appointment. And I just remember being like, no one takes me serious. This is how I felt. Like, no one takes me seriously. No one's listening to me. Do I literally need to what do I need to do for people to actually think that this is real? And I remember like throughout the course of that day, I just remember being like, they said I called 911 9 times throughout the day. And I also did not realize that there was a non-emergency line. So I ended up calling over and throughout different parts of the day and just describing what was going on. Like, I feel like this, like I was in tears, like panic attacks, not able to breathe. And there's a lot of that is a blur. I will say that. I've done a very good job of covering what I do have memory of in my book. So I have everything I remember is inside the story, but there's certain things that I'm like, what happened on all of these 9 calls? What did I say? And that's what happens when at least you go into a period of psychosis where you really are like, that was my experience. Like, I just was like, how did it get to that point? But I just spent so many years ignoring it, dismissing it, running away from it. And eventually, your body breaks down and like you either, physically break down, mentally, both at the same time. And that's what happened throughout the course of the day. And I remember finally that evening, I went to a Christmas party for a friend that I had in high school. And I remember just at the part, I had stormed out. And again, like things that I shouldn't be doing, right? Drinking a lot, very, 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 irritable, very like set off by things. And I think a lot of it led back to like when I opened up about the sexual assault, there were people at that party. And I remember being like, I remember telling you guys, and you were the ones who kind of like spread all this around. And it was very triggering for me. So I'm like, I'm just going to leave. And I remember getting home, and then my dad was like, hey, like, I have some papers from the doctor. There's some other people we can go see. And I just remember like being like ripping it up and like being so frustrated. And again, I ended up calling again 911. I remember the police finally came and talked to my parents and were like, look, like she's done this the entire day. We're taking her right now to go be evaluated. And then that's when they transported me to a facility. And then from there I was transported to a hospital. But it just was like this whole breakdown all day long of and trying to express it and trying to get help for it, and then just feeling like I'm always around these people who just nothing's, and I'm like, how do you not see that something? And it just, again, I didn't really have the tools either. I didn't really know how to go about it, and I just ended up turning into that situation. But I feel like I definitely needed to be where I was. It was a lot of the hospitalization I did not have a good experience. So we can talk about that too. But that's how I ended up there.
Even 10 years ago, mental health and talking about this stuff was still very taboo. So just in the last 10 years, I think we've made strides, at least in making these conversations more public and at least learning a little bit more about it. But my other thought here is you went in on December 19th. Now, obviously, voluntarily, this was obviously something you wanted. You wanted people to hear you. You wanted people to help you. And that's before Christmas. This is before the holidays. And my thought here is, assuming that you celebrate Christmas, that had to be hard, right? Like you're pulling yourself away from what normally is a time of family getting together, tradition, the biggest holiday of the year. And you're choosing to, get help, which is great. But that in itself had to be hard.
Yeah. Well, I do need to tell you that it was an involuntary hospitalization. So I did not choose to go there. I remember just all day calling. And then they ended up taking me, and they're like, and you're being put here and you can't. And I remember like feeling like I'm just trying to share how I'm feeling and like all this, everything. Like there's certain parts that I don't fully remember, but I do remember what happened once I got to the facility. But it was definitely, like an involuntary, like I remember they told my parents, like, we are keeping her for, whatever period of time. And I remember feeling that was also hard coming home and feeling like I was blamed for that by, like, oh, like you ruined the holidays because of this. And I was like, I did everything in my power to be able to come home, but I also ended up being in a very bad position when I did come home because I was very sleep deprived because of where I was. Everyone's in crisis. You're around people who are constantly, and especially like that was hard for me. I'm like, I can't sleep. I can't get sleep because there's people, fighting and things being thrown, screaming, yelling. And I'm like, I feel scared. I feel in danger. And it just was and because of that, right? You're not sleeping for 2 weeks. I ended up coming home, and I've never had this happen before, but I had at least that solid week where I saw and heard things that weren't there. I would see and hear things that I've never had that happen. And I was terrified. And I can't imagine people who live with that every single day. I don't, but there are people in this world who live with this like every day, where it's hard to differentiate, right? Reality, right? From what's being said. And that's how I felt for that week coming home.
Now, let me ask you this, because we're going to get into how you have been able to find balance, living with this. But did you feel some sense of relief when you did get this diagnosis, kind of just knowing like, okay, I knew something was different or something felt kind of, you know what I mean? And now having the diagnosis, did you kind of feel like, okay, now we know where to start. We've got kind of a baseline. We can go from there.
Yeah.
Or did you feel the opposite?
I love that question, because I definitely did feel, so I felt a mix, right? I felt, okay, thankfully, like I have this diagnosis. This is what I was thinking it was all along, right? I was trying to express it. I was constantly dismissed. So I was like, okay, I have this diagnosis, but then the other part of me was like, wow, this means now, like, because I didn't know, I didn't do any research. I've never known anyone else who lived with bipolar besides when you go on Google, you type in bipolar and celebrities and you see all kinds of stories. And I'm like, wow. And I just felt even more stigmatized and alone in it. So part of me was like, okay, at least I have this. But then I was like, now I have this. Now, what do I do? And again, I went back to what I knew, which was running away. And at first I was very open about it. When I came home from the hospital, I told people, I was like, yeah, I was hospitalized. I got this diagnosis. And then I remember feeling like I never want to open up about this again, because I've had people, once I said that, be like, oh, you were in like a psychiatric hospital? Like what? And it was that kind of a reaction. Or, what happened to you? Like, why were you there? And like, I just remember people were treating me differently. And I was like, I thought that this was going to be different. And then it just made it feel worse until I years later kind of was able to see other people and meet other people who had lived with bipolar and managed it. But my experience coming out of the hospital, I was definitely reverting back to what I was doing before, because I didn't learn any skills in there. I didn't get any tools. And I thought that would happen. I'm like, oh, cool. I'll go here and I'll, learn something. But I also wasn't in the best condition to like be able to get that information anyway. Cause I needed to like, just kind of detox and come down from everything I was dealing with. I wasn't in that position, but yeah, I mean, it was both a mix of relief and, okay, I have this diagnosis, and I felt a little bit of hope, but then I lost all of it once I started opening up and feeling dismissed and judged and scared. And then I was like, that's it. I'm not talking about it anymore.
This had to be hard with dating, possibly finding employment, making new friends. I'm just thinking like how this is going to affect, because we're still trying to get used to these conversations, that means the people on the other end of this have to be receptive and accepting. So, how did you navigate all of that too?
Yeah. So that's a good question, because I remember coming out of it and feeling like, so I can start with the first piece I'll start with is dating, right? So talking about that. So I remember when you're in a psychiatric facility, right? If you guys listening, maybe you've experienced or you've had that experience yourself, or maybe you have a loved one or you don't know anything about it, right? What they do is they take you don't have your phone with you, right? So you don't have your phone. So I remember I came out of the hospital, I checked my phone and I had a bunch of messages, calls, whatever. And it made me really sad, because all of it was people that I had met with, that I matched with on Tinder, or people that I met out at the clubs and whatever. And it was just, it didn't seem to be, oh, like, where have you been? Like it was just, hey, when do you want to get together? And then I remember once I started telling everybody, I was getting back to all the messages and saying, hey, this is what happened. It just made me feel even more alone and isolated in that. And I feel like, again, dating, at least what I did with that at the time, I felt like, again, because I had held on so much to that trauma and the shame around going through the sexual assault and then getting into these types of relationships, I was like, I didn't think that I would ever find someone who would first of all value me, because I did not value myself. And it just was going out, partying, drinking, sleeping around. And I would remember like, I started to become the person who had hurt me, right? Who, when I was very young, and even before like going through the sexual assault, different people that I was in relationships with who, would kind of tell me like, I need to be with multiple people to be happy. And I feel like I was very conditioned from a young age of what love looked like. And it wasn't at all what love is, right? Or the love that I have today. And I thought that I had to earn that, and I had to, show, my value in some kind of way. So it was very traumatic and negative. And, even from a very young age, almost getting into, sex work and the sex and entertainment industry and things like this, and being taken advantage of that way. Those are also a lot of things that I don't talk about as much, but again, it goes back to that's really, and again, like when I first met my husband, so we have been married now for 1 year. We got married last March.
Woo-hoo.
So March 4th, 2023. And I remember I met him when I was 23. So yeah, so almost six years ago now. And I met him when I was in a phase of my life when I was very new into doing the work. I just got out of a very bad relationship. But I wanted time to kind of continue working on myself. But I remember it was very different when I did meet him, because it was unlike any other relationship, right? I was very used to people who were like, let's go out, let's drink. It was always around partying and alcohol and drugs and drinking and sex. And he was never like that. He was like, I really want to, what are your passions? What are your interests? And I felt safe. Like I felt like I could open up to him and tell him, here's my fears. Like I was hospitalized and this is what I'm doing. And I remember, I've never had a moment where I regretted it. I've definitely had relationships previous to that one where I did open up about my hospitalization, and it was used against me. And it was kind of like, basically like, you're made fun of, and there's jokes about, oh, bipolar, are you going to act like this, and different things. And it just made me feel like, again, like, am I ever going to be able to find a path to have a good life with something like this? And that's really something I struggled with. And again, you're talking about other relationships, right? Friendships, finding employment. I've had so many struggles with that in the past, right? I remember feeling like, going through so many jobs and quitting and being fired and all these things, and feeling like I'm such a failure. And then it's like I holding on to my identity, right? Like I'm like, oh, like I've always been, I love learning and I love school and I was so good at school. So why can't I, be successful in like a career? And why do I, have these? And again, that was the thing, is I was looking at it wrong, right? I wasn't going after the things that, lit me up. I was trying to do things to make everyone around me happy and have them look at me and say, okay, I'm proud of you, or whatever this might be. But again, like I also, with friends, my friends were also not the people that, they liked being around the person I was, right? This entertaining, loud, but again, that person was very hurt and was doing these things to forget. And as soon as I started to set boundaries and say, hey, I'm not going to go out every weekend. I don't want to get like blackout drunk all the time with you. I lost those friends. And I had these people say, well, you're being lame now. You're so boring. Why are you like this? And I remember just being like, and it was actually funny because it's when I first started my podcast. So I first launched my podcast. It was February of 2020. And I remember sending it to like everyone I knew. I was like, hey guys, I don't know what I'm doing. I started this thing. Like, can you listen to it? And I remember I had a person, I was like, this is my friend, like send me a message back. And she's like, can you stop sending me these episodes or whatever you're making? I don't care. I don't listen to podcasts. I don't care about this stuff. And honestly, like, I'm not going to listen to it. And I remember feeling like so hurt and sick to my stomach. And I was like, wow, like, is this stupid? Like, should I just like quit? And like, should I stop doing this? But that's really when I started to see it, right? Like I started to see the people who are really there for me. And a lot of it is, I've discovered this through the podcast. The podcast it started with me and my story. But then I opened it up, and now it's become a place to offer those resources to people who live with bipolar disorder and are navigating that journey, because I've been able to show stories and it's given me hope and it's taught me a lot. And if it wasn't for the podcast, I would not be talking to you. I would have never met you. I would have never connected with you. And I think that that's really what it was, is, you know, I felt the fear, but I said, I'm going to start small and start with what I'm comfortable with. And I guess, you know, and I was like, maybe I'll grow, maybe I won't, but you always will grow by starting small. You will.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Paris from the Live Well Bipolar podcast. Tune in next week to hear the second part of our conversation. In next week's episode, she'll talk about what she's learned, her daily wellness ritual, and finding her confidence and her people. She'll also reveal something that was not planned for this episode. In fact, she did something just an hour before we pressed record. You'll hear exactly what this surprise announcement is in next week's episode. To be part of the exclusive listener group, hit the follow button on whichever podcast platform you're listening to right now. When you follow, you'll be the first to know about new episodes, so you can listen before anyone else. You'll also have quick access to the show, making it convenient to find for the next time. For more free content, join me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and online at peaceofmepodcast.com.